You are watching the World 24/7 on the NDTV network. I'm Parmeshwar Bawa. Let's begin with the headlines we're tracking at the moment. US President Joe Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is embarking on several days of talks with top Chinese officials in Beijing this week, aimed at quieting tensions between the two superpowers ahead of the upcoming November election. By the way, Jake Sullivan's trip is the first by a US National Security Advisor since 2016. Meanwhile, US prosecutors have filed a revised criminal indictment charging Donald Trump with election interference in an attempt to keep the case alive after a Supreme Court ruling granted broad immunity to former presidents. More than 70,000 international student graduates in Canada face the risk of being deported due to recent changes in federal immigration policies. The students who came to Canada with hopes of building a new life are now protesting across the country. US Vice President Kamala Harris and her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, will sit down with CNN for their first joint interview since they launched their campaign. The growing monkeypox outbreaks in Africa that triggered the World Health Organization's emergency declaration are largely the result of decades of neglect and the global community's inability to stop sporadic epidemics among a population with little immunity against the smallpox-related disease, leading African scientists have argued. Well, our big focus. US President Joe Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is embarking on several days of talks with top Chinese officials in Beijing this week, aimed at quieting tensions between the two superpowers ahead of the 5th of November US election. Jake Sullivan, China's top diplomat Wang Yi, and others meet for talks till Thursday as the two countries are actually at odds over the Middle East and Ukraine, Chinese territorial claims from Taiwan to the South China Sea, and trade. But in the final months of his presidency, Joe Biden has pushed direct diplomacy to influence Chinese President Xi Jinping. Right, for further clarity, we have with us Roger Liu. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on the World 24/7. Now, just last week, accepting the Democratic nomination, Kamala Harris had said that she would ensure that America, not China, wins the competition for the 21st century. Meanwhile, Trump has actually vowed across-the-board tariffs as well. You think China has a preference in the upcoming election contest in the United States?
Well, it's very hard to tell because, I think China will prefer anyone who will follow the Chinese policy and work better with the United States. But if we take a look at the situation right now, I'm afraid that no matter who comes to power, he or she will be taking strong stance against the United States against China from the perspective of the United States of America. Because, like you said, China and the U.S. has been their source of conflict surrounds around three major things. The first one will be Taiwan. Taiwan will be the core interest according to China, and this is not going to change in the coming decades. So this will be the first one. The second one will be the export control on the high technology, emerging technology, especially semiconductors. And the third one will be around South China Sea and all the regional events, just like the U.S., the Russia and Ukrainian war. And what will be happening here that everybody has been paying attention here is the coming war in the Middle East. And all these things will take the United States and China to work together to control and to manage well of the crisis which are going to happen.
Right. In fact, many analysts, though, Roger Liu, aligned with Donald Trump, see Biden's current approach as too soft in the face of China's increasingly assertive foreign policy. Now, do you believe that Jake Sullivan is on a mission to expand military-to-military talks down to the theater command level?
Well, I think I'm pessimistic about what's going to happen because, well, this talk between Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi will be more like a formality than anything that will bring up a substantial change. Because first, China knows that Biden is stepping down. no matter who becomes the president, Biden will be on his last term. So they will not take seriously what Biden and his administrators are going to say about this. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that if the U.S. really want to show strong stance, the Chinese will just call it bluffing because they know that Biden is stepping down. So the most meaningful part of this meeting will be the talk itself, the maintenance of the channel and the possibility of the United States and China to talk for the years to come.
Right, thank you so much, Roger Liu, for joining us with those quick comments on the World 24/7. Well, Beijing does plan to express its disapproval over US tariffs on a range of manufactured goods and export controls targeting Chinese chip makers. Taiwan is also likely to come up in talks this week. Meanwhile, a Chinese government-backed group hacked into several US internet service providers with millions of their customers in recent months. This is what the Washington Post is reporting. And some of the targets actually appear to include undercover government and military personnel, alarming cybersecurity experts. In fact, local media is reporting that even though Chinese hacking efforts are common, the latest attempt is dramatically stepped up from where it used to be. The report comes, as you are well aware, during US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's visit to Beijing as he attempts to ease tensions between the two superpowers ahead of the November showdown. Well, meanwhile, US Vice President Kamala Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz will sit for a joint interview with CNN on Thursday. This is what the network has announced. And why does this matter? Well, it's the first formal interview for Harris after more than 5 weeks of campaigning. That long delay means she'll be under additional scrutiny for her performance in this CNN interview. She's also been challenged over her lack of media appearances. Her team had said that she'd do an interview with a national outlet by the 31st of August. So all eyes will be on that interview tomorrow. As you know, Kamala Harris has also yet to hold a press conference. But Donald Trump, by contrast, appears frequently on cable news and other formats like podcasts in the US, though often with friendly interviewers. But Harris has faced criticism for taking virtually no questions since launching her campaign. And some in her campaign have actually argued there's been little need during her extended political honeymoon. The other big headline in the United States, US prosecutors have filed a revised criminal indictment charging Donald Trump with election interference in an attempt to keep the case alive after a Supreme Court ruling granted broad immunity to former presidents. The indictment kept the 4 original changes intact but removed allegations of Trump's attempts to pressure the Justice Department into promoting his false claims of election fraud, as the Supreme Court ruled that such interactions fell under his official presidential duties. The indictment comes as Trump's rival, Kamala Harris, continues to ride a wave of momentum in the final months of the election race. More than 200 staffers of prominent Republicans signed a letter endorsing her, saying the alternative is simply untenable.
Yeah, I haven't read the whole thing, but it looks like Jack Smith doing more what he does, which is filing these absurd lawsuits in an effort to influence the election.
In other crucial news, hundreds of Indian student graduates have staged protests against a new federal policy in Canada that puts them at risk of getting deported from the country. Hundreds of Indian student graduates have staged protests against a new federal policy in Canada that puts them at risk of getting deported from the country. In fact, many international students, especially from India, had high hopes of starting fresh in Canada. But new immigration changes have thrown a big curveball for over 70,000 graduates. Indian students have been camping out in front of the Legislative Assembly in Prince Edward Island for over 3 months, and protests are now also popping up in Manitoba and British Columbia. So what exactly is changing? Well, the Canadian government is slashing permanent residency nominations by 25% and putting stricter limits on study permits. This actually comes as Canada has been experiencing rapid population growth. In fact, 97% of last year's increase was due to immigration. And then with local housing and job issues heating up, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government is under pressure to cut back on temporary residents. Plus, they're rolling back their 2022 decision to expand temporary foreign worker permits, as we've extensively reported as well. These permits are meant to help fill short-term labor gaps, but now there's a new focus on reducing the influx. Canada is cutting back on temporary foreign workers, reversing a 2022 expansion, and this program, which actually helps fill short-term labor gaps, will see fewer permits issued now, because in 2023, Canada granted about 183,800 temporary foreign worker permits, which was an 88% jump from 2019. However, I must inform our viewers that the Employment and Social Development Canada Department has called out employers for misusing the program to avoid hiring local talent. But these new rules will now deny work permits in these areas where unemployment is 6% or higher, though there are exemptions for key sectors like agriculture, food processing, construction and healthcare. Listen in to what Justin Trudeau had to say.
This fall, we'll be presenting for the first time an immigration's levels plan that doesn't just talk about permanent residents, but also talks about temporary residents, whether it's foreign workers or others. And we're making sure that the entire package makes as much sense as possible for the needs of Canadians and for the needs of our economy. That's why the first steps we're taking today of reducing the number of low-paid temporary foreign workers that can come work in this country is part of the response.
Meanwhile, in a major crackdown against migration, Australia, in addition to Canada, has also introduced new laws to cap Indian migrants. Now, with these new migration restrictions in Australia and Canada, avenues for Indian migrants are limiting foreign opportunities for students as well as workers. The big question now is, will these moves open up alternative education and employment hubs elsewhere? Well, here's our report.
In a major crackdown against migration, Australia and Canada have introduced new laws to cap Indian migrants. In a bid to rein in record levels of migration that have increased house rental prices, the Australian government has announced to limit its foreign student intake to 270,000 next year. The move is set to have a considerable impact on Indian students going abroad for higher education.
गवर्नमेंट है वो स्टूडेंट्स के बारे में इतना नहीं सोचती कि वो इतना बड़ा लोन लेते हैं। जैसे बाहर जाने के लिए पहले वीज़ा आता है, वीज़ा के लिए उन्होंने अप्लाई करते हैं तो लोन चाहिए होता है, एजुकेशन लोन। तो जो फाइनेंशियल लोन लेंगे हम, उस पर जो हमारी घर है, घर का लोन लेंगे, घर पे लोन लेंगे, किसी ना किसी पर लोन लेंगे।
मैं ऑस्ट्रेलिया में जाना चाहती हूँ एंड ये डिसीजन देख के ऐसा लग रहा है कि गवर्नमेंट को इसके ऊपर थोड़ा ध्यान देना चाहिए। मेरा करियर कहीं ना कहीं वो हो रहा है, अफेक्ट कर रहा है उसे, और जो लोन्स ले रही है मेरी फैमिली और यहाँ का खर्चा, मैं एक्चुअली हरियाणा से बिलोंग करती हूँ।
In an unprecedented move, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has also announced to tighten the rules around the temporary foreign worker program. Starting next month, Canadian businesses will only be allowed to fill up to 10% of their workforce with low-wage foreign workers, down from the previous 20%. This decision comes in response to the rising unemployment rates in the country and right after the UN released a report alleging that the program was a breeding ground for contemporary slavery. In a social media post uploaded by the Canadian Prime Minister, Trudeau stressed that the labour market has changed tremendously in recent years, which has shifted the focus on Canadian workers and youth. With new migration restrictions in Australia and Canada, avenues for Indian migrants are limiting foreign opportunities for students and workers. The question now arises, will these moves open up alternative education and employment hubs elsewhere? Samia Afsar for NDTV World.
Meanwhile, the growing Mpox outbreaks in Africa that triggered the World Health Organization's emergency declaration are largely the result of decades of neglect and the global community's inability to stop sporadic epidemics among a population with little immunity against the smallpox-related disease, leading African scientists arguing. Now, according to the WHO Mpox Emergency Committee, negligence has led to a new, more transmissible version of the virus emerging in countries with few resources to stop outbreaks. As you are aware, monkeypox had been spreading mostly undetected for years in Africa before the disease prompted the 2022 outbreak in more than 70 countries, and it mostly spread through close skin-to-skin contact, including sex, and people with more serious cases can develop prominent blisters on the face, hands, chest and genitals, as has been highlighted by the WHO as well. Let's get you a quick update as far as the Russia-Ukraine war is concerned. Ukraine now claims to control 100 Russian settlements and more than 1,200 square kilometers of Russian territory following the start of their incursion into the Kursk region 3 weeks ago. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, said he would present the United States with a plan of victory to end the war with Russia during his upcoming visit to New York. Kyiv's surprise incursion into Russia's Kursk region, though, is a bargaining chip to compel Moscow into ending the war diplomatically during potential negotiations later this year. This is what Zelensky has said, as he renewed pleas to ease Western restrictions on striking Russian targets. Joining us for a quick comment on the matter, Irina Sukuman, the geopolitical analyst and national security attorney. Thanks so much, Irina, for making time for us. Ukraine's audacious foray now into Russia's Kursk. Many argue it's been a triumph for its military intelligence and tactical agility, and equally a signal that despite its advantage in terms of men and armor, the Russian military has plenty of vulnerabilities?
I think it's true. I think one of the things this foray showcased is that the war does not have to end the way everyone thinks it's going to end with either a complete Russia takeover or mandated territorial compromise, because Ukraine has been able to turn the tables. It's been able to challenge Russia on its own territory, and it showed the weakness of Russia's defenses. It is only a matter of time before Russia has to prioritize and choose its battles effectively, and at the end of the day, it will have to defend its own territories. It will not be able to maintain the same level of fighting, of combat in Ukraine without also sacrificing something on the home front.
Well, let's see. We have 4 months left for the year to end. Let's see if there's an end of the war on the radar. Thank you so much, Irina Sukuman, for joining us with that quick comment.
Thank you.
As always, news and updates continue on NDTV. Slipping into a very quick break for now. Welcome back. Israeli special forces rescued a hostage held by Hamas in the southern Gaza Strip. This is what Israel Defense Forces have confirmed in an official statement. He was actually rescued from a Hamas tunnel in southern Gaza by the IDF Navy SEALs unit, and there are now 108 hostages being held in Gaza. We actually have a reaction lined up for you. The hostage was speaking to Benjamin Netanyahu. Listen in.
كم؟ أهلا وسهلا يا بيبي يا أبو يعير. قام أني سماح حكيت لرجازي تشبالك أبو يعير. كان يشلي شنو الذي شريبته.
Switching tracks, Iran's supreme leader has opened the door to renewed negotiations with the United States over his country's rapidly advancing nuclear program, telling its civilian government there was no harm in engaging with its enemy. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, his remarks set clear red lines for any talks taking place under the government of reformist President Masoud Pezeshkian, and renewed his warnings that Washington was not to be trusted. Let's turn our attention now to the United Kingdom. Well, in his first major speech since becoming Prime Minister, Keir Starmer told the British people on their country that it was actually in a societal and economic black hole, and that the UK, things will only get worse there before they get better. The speech was remarkable for its woeful description of modern Britain, and Starmer repeatedly deployed the word rot to describe the condition of the country he now leads, as in a house with a rotting foundation that needs more than a cosmetic coat of paint. Afterward, even supporters wondered aloud whether he was painting too gloomy a picture, but Keir Starmer maintained that he wanted to be honest In contrast, he said to his predecessors, whom he blamed for the current state of affairs and for selling British people this snake oil of populism. Listen in to Keir Starmer's reaction.
There is a budget coming in October, and it's going to be painful. We have no other choice, given the situation that we're in.
Meanwhile, a young 16-year-old has taken up the challenge of swimming the English Channel solo. Prisha Thapre will soon be the youngest British Indian to perform the feat, being done to raise awareness on the significance of fitness for young girls, particularly of Asian communities, to fight several stigmas attached to girls in sport, especially swimming. Swimming the English Channel is one of the toughest things to do. Some have compared climbing Mount Everest as slightly easier, but Prisha is also raising funds for the charity Akshay Patra to enable the girl child with nutrition and education. Radhika Iyer meets Prisha, who is ready to make waves.
Having turned 16 only days ago, Prisha Thapre is rehearsing her strokes. She's headed for a big swim. Prisha has taken up the challenge of swimming the English Channel, the arm of the Atlantic Ocean that connects England and France, and she will do that solo. That is no mean feat. Swimming the English Channel, according to many, is harder than climbing Mount Everest. Only 2,000 adults and young people world over have done this. And why does Prisha want to do this?
I assume I'm crazy, but I think that I really wanted to challenge myself. Like, if you told me 4 years ago I was going to swim the English Channel, I would laugh in your face. Part of the reason I'm raising money for a charity and I want people to know about the swim is because I want other ethnic minority groups, and especially like girls, to get into swimming, because I've noticed that there aren't many girls who are into the sport necessarily, and I really want to influence them to start, because open water it's getting more popular.
The English Channel, very challenging and cold, is 560 kilometers long. At its narrowest, it is 34 kilometers long, which is what Prisha would have achieved at the end of her swim.
This is the cold. I think for most people, they're not used to swimming in water that can be less than 17 degrees throughout for that amount of time, for at least 12, 14 hours. So, it's a big physical challenge, yes. And mental, of course. I mean, the majority of it is mental. But having the right training and the right support with you on the boat, cheering you on the way, makes anything possible. So Prisha's got some good people around, not just me. But she's really, really done well in her training, and I have every confidence in her.
Yeah, so ready.
Prisha hopes not to meet shark during her swim. Jellyfish can sting, but the 16-year-old says she could deal with that, as bigger sacrifices need to be made. Radhika Iyer in the UK, NDTV.
Well, let's turn our attention now to Croatia, where over 100 firefighters work to fight back a wildfire overnight in Split. There are fears strong winds could reignite it. But temperatures during July and August were extremely high in Croatia, and Croatian firefighters in July managed to fend off several wildfires after a dramatic night along the country's Adriatic Sea coastline, fueled by high temperatures, winds, and weeks-long drought. Thank you for investing your time and watching this edition of The World 24/7. We'll keep tracking the latest updates for you. Do stay tuned.